In this lecture, we're going to talk about how to render out passes from Zbrush and bring them into Photoshop for compositing. So to begin with, we've got a model with PolyPaint and subtools loaded up onto the canvas. What we want to do is set our document resolution, so the document that we bring into Photoshop will be oriented in portrait and also will be the correct resolution. So to do that, we're going to go to the document window, and down here we have our resolution settings. I'm going to turn off proportional, and I'm going to set the width to, let's say, 768 and the height to 1024. Now this isn't going to be the final resolution. I'm just going to resize the document to this proportion. Control N will clear the canvas of anything that's on it, and now I'll go to Document and I'll just click double and it'll double size the document. Now I can't see the full document, so what I want to do is zoom out using the zoom button here. I'll draw the model back on the canvas and then go into edit mode. Now that I'm in edit mode, I can rotate and position the character in a way that's sort of appealing, something that, a nice sort of look. So let's zoom in and let's get this in a nice sort of 3/4 view. We can go to our draw settings and we can adjust our focal length on our camera. We can bring it up to 85, leave it at 50, or perhaps put it somewhere in between. Maybe we'll set it to 60. And that will adjust the perspective distortion. And I just want to make sure that I'm taking full advantage of the space here. Maybe zoom in a little bit and just crop off some of that chest. Now, I don't want to lose this orientation, so I will go to Movie, Timeline, Show, that shows the timeline, and I'm just going to click 2 keyframes here for the camera. So if I accidentally move my camera, I can just use the left and right arrow keys, and that will restore the model position. Now I want to set up some lighting, so I'll go to the light menu and I'll take my key light here and we'll move it to about, let's say 11 o'clock. I'll set my intensity to 1. And now let's turn on that secondary light and bring it up to about 3 o'clock. Turn up the intensity, and then if we want, we can actually change the color of this. Maybe we'll make that purple. Make it not quite so saturated. Now if I click on the dot here that represents the light, it'll put it behind the model and it will give me this nice rim light, and then I can move that around and adjust how strong, make sure we don't double click it, that brings it back to the front. Now we can move it around and get the rim light that we want. And then I can adjust the intensity. If it's too strong, I can dial that back a little bit. Get it just right. Maybe let's make it not quite so purple. Let's bring it up towards white here. And then let's increase our intensity again. There we go. So we get a nice rim light that sort of carves out some shape and helps define the character. Now this is going to be my render project. I want to be able to save this and always return to the same model orientation in case I ever want to reload this and render more passes. So to do that, we simply go to File, Save As, and then we just save it as a project. Now saving it as a project will of course save your camera position, save your keyframes, save your lighting, and any Z tools that you have open. Now I'm just going to take the Move brush really quickly, turn on X Symmetry, make sure that the subtool that's selected is the character head, and make sure X Symmetry is on. Let's turn the draw size up, and just to make things a little bit easier, I'm just going to pull the shoulders out and down a little bit just so they're cropped out. There we go. Turn our draw size down. Let's just adjust these shapes, and oops, I accidentally turned on frame mode. And let's go ahead and just bring some width to the shoulders here. And that's just going to make it sort of fill the space a little bit nicer. It's not going to just be a bust floating in space. Now there's 2 ways to render passes out of Zbrush. The first way is by going to Z Plugin. Let's tear this off on the side of the screen and go to ZBrush to Photoshop. Now ZBrush to Photoshop is an automated plugin that allows me to select all these different render passes and then export them as a document to Photoshop. So it starts with albedo, which is the relative brightness or darkness of a character, ambient occlusion, a best preview render pass, a best render pass, color bump, depth, a mask, which is just the overall silhouette, the lights. Let's turn on the ones that we're going to use. We're going to use mask, we're going to use depth. We have object space normal map, We have polygroup ID, so anything that's polygrouped will be rendered out as a pass. We have shadows, which we definitely want. We have a preview render pass, which we'll render that out. We have a specular pass. We can do subsurface scattering. We can do subtool ID. That's a clown pass where every subtool has its own color. We can do a structure pass. We can do a mask for the different subtools, and there's a tangent space normal pass. And we can also do wireframe, which is very nice to have. Now, these 5 slots here are just for other materials. So any material that I have selected in the material palette, if I click one of these buttons, it will assign whatever material is selected to those passes. Now, if I want, I can clear the layer cache. So basically, when this is generated, it creates a smart image. So you can continually update your render passes, and it'll update in your Photoshop file. If you're having problems, you can clear your layer cache. If you're trying to create a new render, you can clear your layer cache and it will break those connections. And this button here will set the application path for Photoshop. If you have not used this before, it will prompt you to tell ZBrush where Photoshop is. So now I'm going to click Send to Photoshop CC, and it will render out each one of these passes, put them into a document, and then open it up in Photoshop. So let's see that now. Now, before I execute my render, I just want to clean things up by deleting any extraneous subtools here. So I'm just going to delete this subtool. These 2 variant heads that I have stored here, we'll delete this one as well. So the only subtools that I currently have are the head and the eyes. So now let's click the Send to Photoshop CC button. And what will happen is it will go through and render each one of these passes, save it in a cache file, and then load it into Photoshop as a Photoshop document with smart objects. So this might take a little bit of time, so I will pause the video and then come back when these have finished. And here we are in Photoshop. It automatically opens and the document is here on screen. You see it's organized with a top layer. There's our top layer. If I collapse that, you see that it does have a mask associated with it, and that is a folder with all the other subfolders. We also have a background with a mask associated. If we wanted to, we could double click this and we could change our background color just like so. I'd never like to use a black, always try and use a mid-gray. Now let's go ahead and open up our folder here, and you see that we've got a variety of different subfolders. We have our masks. There is the mask, no ambient occlusion. There is our second mask. There is a polysphere mask for the eyes, and then a mask for the head. We'll collapse that. You see that we have an effects grouping here. We have a wireframe. And you see these layers automatically have their blending mode set. So the wireframe layer is set to multiply. If we turn this back to normal, you see it's just black wireframe on a white background. But when it's set to multiply, the white disappears and the dark is applied to the model. We have our ambient occlusion, which is our nice shadowing. Here we have a specular. We turn that on and off. You see we get a bit of shine. Now you can go in here and you can adjust this, this image if you like. But remember, these are smart objects right now. So that is a smart object. We'll get to that in a bit. Here we have our shadow pass. Under geometry, we have our subtool ID, which is a different color for each subtool. We have our polygroup ID, which would be colors for polygrouping. We have our depth pass. Now everything coming towards us will be more white. Everything going away will be darker. This can be used in an alpha or a mask to help create subsurface scattering or atmospheric perspective or even lens blur. And then there is our structure pass. Now scrolling down, we have a folder of lights. So we have our various lighting passes, which are rendered here. So these are all very, very handy, and you see that they're automatically set to screen mode. So we don't have to worry about changing our blending mode on these. So you can turn these on and mix them up, maybe change their blending mode and see what type of results you get. Materials, if we had selected any custom materials, they would be in this folder. And then we have our base layers. There's our preview render. There is our albedo. Let me turn that off. There is our albedo, which is just the flat color essentially. And then there's the BPR. And there we go. So our preview is set to normal, our albedo is set to normal, and our BPR is set to normal. And these are just sort of the bases upon which everything else is built. So if I were to collapse these groups, if I wanted to, I could just turn all of these off. So the only thing we're seeing at this point are our base layers. There's my preview render, there's my albedo, and there's my BPR. So if we turn these back on, I can turn this off, and then I'm only applying to the albedo layer. Turn that off, and I'm only applying to the BPR layer. Now, if you want to get rid of all these smart objects, if you don't want to keep any kind of smart link with Photoshop, it may better suit the way you work. Personally, that's how I prefer to work. If I'm going to be using layers, I don't want them to be smart objects. Just that's my preference. I will select the top layer, right click, and then, oops, let's make sure that we right click over here. And we should have rasterize layers. Let's go ahead and actually select our groups down here. Let's go ahead and shift click all of these all the way down. So I've just selected everything. I'm going to right click, and there we have rasterized layers. If I click that, those layers now live inside this Photoshop document. We have broken any smart linking, and they are simply here in this document, and I don't have to worry about not being able to edit something because it's a smart object. That's just my personal preference of working in Photoshop. Others, I've had a student in my class recently who comes from a graphic design background, and she swears by smart objects, and it seems like a very efficient way of working. It's very similar to referencing in Maya, where you can update a layer from outside of Zbrush, outside of a document, and it will update in any document that it's smart linked to. So this is the Zbrush to Photoshop process. Now I'd like to show you another process for rendering passes out where we set them up manually. And I include this because it's the way I usually work myself, and it's the way I teach Zbrush to Photoshop, because the plugin I find is a little hard for people to understand if they have not done it manually. You're not necessarily always aware of what blending modes are or why you want to stack things in a certain way. So let's go back over to Zbrush and let's do another render, and let's manually export these passes. So here we are back in Zbrush. We're still in our project file. We still have our camera set up and our document set up. We have our lighting. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to render our passes manually. Now, the first thing I want to point out is if I do a BPR render, I want to point out something about the shadows. Now, this is something, if you choose to use the Zbrush to Photoshop plugin, you'll want to set up your BPR shadows and transparency settings, any of those settings first, so they factor into your renders. I want to take this opportunity, though, to point out that our default shadow setting, which we ended up using in the first part of this tutorial, creates a very hard edge shadow, as you see here. And this really isn't appealing to look at or particularly realistic. So to fix that, we go to Render, open BPR Shadow, and we turn up the angle slider. The angle slider will soften the shadow edge, and it does that for free. There's no addition to the render time, but it can create banding in the shadows. So we want to go into our rays and we want to increase these. I'm going to double them to 24. That will help blend out any banding that we get in the shadow. So now let's render again, and you will notice the render takes longer this time because it's having to calculate all those extra rays, those 24 rays rather than 12. The angle slider, that's just going to soften the shadow edge. That won't change our render time at all. Sometimes you can get away with just adjusting the angle, but I do recommend increasing your rays just to give yourself a higher quality shadow. It just makes such a big difference later on down the line. So if you watch the shadows on screen, you'll see them update here in just a moment. Right about now. You see those shadow edges just soften considerably. They become a lot more appealing and realistic looking. So I'm going to go back to my render settings here. Let's go to Render, and I'm going to go to Render Properties. I want to render ambient occlusion, so I'm going to turn that on, and I'm going to once again do a BPR render. Now, what's happening when we render with BPR? If we go back to the render folder here, go to the render option, and we go to render pass, you'll see it's automatically rendering and storing render passes here. There we've got our composite image, we have our shaded view, depth pass, shadow pass. This is where our ambient occlusion will go, and that's where our mask will go. So let's go ahead now and render again. Now, because we've added ambient occlusion, it's going to take a bit longer to render. So I will pause the video at this point and then return when it has completed its render. And there we go, the render has completed. So now if we go to the render passes, you see that we have that ambient occlusion stored in there now. Now to get these out of Zbrush, we simply click on the image and it's going to ask us to store or to save wherever we want to save it to. So I'm going to go ahead and save these images out just by going into my storage folder. So let's go ahead and go to our folder now. So as I click on each one of these, let's go back to our render menu, click on the next one, and we'll just save it. They're going to save with the name of what pass it is. Now, I want to create a render that doesn't actually have any specular shine on it. So I'm going to change to the basic material and make sure that I'm on the head. I'm going to go to the material channel and go to color, fill object, and that will fill this with just a flat material with no shine. I'm also going to turn off my color. And let's turn off color on the eyes as well. And then we will go ahead and export this. Now, I don't need to render this pass to export it. However, everything that we render with BPR and export from here is automatically anti-aliased and half-sized. Since I'm going to export this directly from the document window, I need to make sure I have not pressed the AA half button, because if I do that, it will export at half the document size. So I have to click the actual size button and then go to Document Export, and then I will save this as my gray pass. The reason for that is we want it to line up with the other images when we composite them together in Photoshop. Let's turn color back on, and then we will change to the flat color material. Go to Material, Color, Fill Object, and then we will export this as well. To go to Document, Export, Color. Now, of course, this is just like the albedo pass that we rendered automatically earlier. So now how do we load these together in Photoshop? Well, let's go back to Photoshop now. Now here we are back in Photoshop, and you see this is the passes folder where we saved out all of those passes. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open them all at one time and explain. What we need to do is convert all of the images, well, not all of the images, make sure all of the images are the same format. The reason being, I'm going to run a script in Photoshop that needs them all to be the same format to work. If we just take this render here and go to image mode, you see it's RGB color 8-bit. That's what we want to be using. So I can close this render out. The color render will be fine. The BPR render is fine. The depth pass, however, needs to be converted. So I go to image mode, and it's set to grayscale, so I change it to RGB color. Now this is very important. On the depth pass, this is a 16-bit image. Make sure you change it to 8-bit. Save it and close it. If you don't change it to 8-bit, your entire document will be 16-bit and your file sizes will be massive, and it'll cause a lot of problems for you. Here we are on the shadow pass. Go to image mode, and you see it's set to multi-channel. So I set it to grayscale first, then go back and set it to RGB color. It's already 8-bit, so I can save it and close it. Here again, we just go to grayscale, and then change from grayscale to RGB color, save and close. Here we're on our mask, so we go to grayscale, and then RGB color, save and close. Our grayscale render we don't need to worry about, and our flat color render we don't need to worry about. Now, let's go back to File, Scripts, and there is a script here called Load Files into Stack. If I select that, it asks me to pull up the source files, so I'm just going to once again select all these images again. Oops, let's go ahead and grab them all, click Open, and then click OK. And what it does is it opens up each one of those files, loads it as a layer into a new Photoshop document, and then names that layer for the file. So here you see we've got our different layers. I'm going to take the ambient occlusion layer, and I'm going to take the shadow layer, and I'm going to put those at the top here. I'm going to put my BPR composite at the bottom because I don't really use that because it has the specular and it has the shadows baked into it. I'm going to put my mask up here at the top, and I'm going to put my depth at the top. I'll shift click these two layers and then Control G to group them, and I just call this group utility. And then I'll just turn off visibility on that. Now I'm going to take BPR render, and I'm going to put that at the bottom as well. So what I end up with is this. I've got my gray shaded render, I have my color pass, my shadow pass, and ambient occlusion. So let's start with the gray render. We're going to go to color, and we can set the color to actually a couple of different blending modes might be useful for this. We can set it to color, and that'll put just the color down. We can set it to overlay, and that will put the color down as overlay. You might try hard light. You might try soft light. Those are all kind of interesting. You can also change to, oh no, excuse me, not saturation, hue. Put it down as hue. So these are all interesting options that you can try. If I go back to my gray shaded layer here and I adjust the levels on this, if I darken this a little bit, it will control how saturated that color appears to be. If I turn on my BPR shadow layer, I can set this to multiply. Remember, a multiply layer, everything dark shows through. So this gives me total control over my shadow controls here. So I can control just how dense that shadow is. Ambient occlusion, I'll do the same. I'll set it to multiply and then dial back the ambient occlusion. Now at this point I want to add more render passes, so let's go back to ZBrush. So let's go ahead and switch color to black. Make sure that we're on the head, and I'm going to go to RGB, color, fill object. This is a different way of making a specular pass than the ZBrush to Photoshop plugin does. I'm going to go to my material settings, and I'm going to go to modifiers, and I'm going to turn the specular controls up, and I might just broaden the curve a little bit. And then all I need to do is go to Document, Export, and I can save this as specular. Now the next pass that I want to do is a mask pass. So I'm going to switch back to white, go to Color, Fill Object, and I am going to go into the flat color material. And now I've got a mask, which also has unmasked areas for the eyes. If I had multiple subtools, I'd probably want to go in here and fill them with color and material. So I'm going to do this. I'll turn on mRGB and then do Color, Fill Object. Then I'll switch to my other subtool and select a different color and go to Color, Fill Object. And then I will go to Document, Export, and save this as mats. So that's just the color-coded subtool ID, just like we had in our ZBrush to Photoshop filter, or plugin. I keep calling it a filter, but it's a plugin. Now let's go ahead and open those two passes. So let's go ahead and close out of that and open. We'll select mats and specular, click open. Now I'm just going to select all with Control A and then Control C to copy, close out of that specular pass, and then we'll just paste it here and then change the blending mode to screen. And then that gives us control over how much shiny and where it's shiny. Let's go back over to our mats pass, select all and copy, and then we'll paste it in here, and then I'll just put that inside my utilities layer. So now I can very, very easily magic wand select the eyes or the head. We'll do that now. I'm just going to do a magic wand selection. I won't use the subtool mats. I'll just use the top mask layer here, BPR mask, that one. Go to magic wand and magic wand select the marching ants go around the perimeter of the head. I will invert that selection. And then let's turn off visibility on that. And then as we go through each one of these layers, I can knock the background out of it. There we go. Let's turn our specular and our shadows back on. And now we have a transparent background. So I can add a new layer here with Control-Shift-N, call it background, and then we can just fill that with a nice 50% gray. Control-A, and then just Alt-Delete to fill that, and we can put that at the bottom. So that is how we manually do ZBrush render passes and then composite them together in Photoshop. And then we can do further painting on top of this to make a nice presentation image. I think it's valuable for you to understand how to manually set these documents up, because when I first started teaching the ZBrush to Photoshop plugin, when it was first released, after years of teaching this method I just showed you, I realized for the first time students were really confused by what they were doing with the render passes in ZBrush and the render passes in Photoshop. So I went back to teaching the manual method first, and that I think made it a lot easier for people then to know why they're using the plugin and what the plugin is doing. So I hope you found this video helpful, and I'll see you in the next chapter.